Strategy is the art of seeing what has not yet happened and acting before it becomes inevitable. There are books that make us enter as if entering a maze, where every turn not only challenges the intellect but also exposes the deep limits in the way we perceive others and ourselves. Thinking Strategic by Avinas Dixit and Barry Knoop is such a book. It is not simply a theoretical economic handbook or a dry math game. This is a map of power, strategy, and interaction that spans from politics, business to the small situations of everyday life, on the reading journey. Each page is a reminder that life rarely gives us the freedom to choose in a vacuum, and that most of the decisions we make are woven into a web of desire and calculation. And the uncertainty of others. So how can we not only react but also shape the game? Is it possible that cold sobriety is the only way to protect the most fragile values? And before going into this summary, we encourage listeners to buy and read the book to fully appreciate its content. Because only when you read this book will you understand the issues I am talking about. Please buy the book and support the author. Now let's get started. Summary of this book. Part 1. People often think of strategy as dry blueprints, cold numbers, or complicated diagrams drawn on paper. But for me, strategy starts with everyday stories, situations everyone has encountered. Where intuition tells one thing but reality reveals a completely different outcome. I would like to open this story with 10 anecdotes, as 10 small mirrors. Reflecting on how strategic thinking can upset our intuition. Think of them as a pre-party dessert, tantalizing rather than filling. The first story is called Hot Hand. Have you ever heard basketball commentators talk about Larry Bue's hair Tony? There were moments when they shot basket after basket and it seemed impossible to miss. People call it hot hand. Statistics show that there is no such thing as hot hand, it is just an illusion caused by a series of luck. But let me point out one thing, even if Tony's success rate doesn't increase, the fact that he hits several in a row forces opponents to lock down. And that's when his teammates are more comfortable throwing, scoring more easily. A hot hand is not just about the pitcher, it's about the whole team changing the game because of the pressure he creates. Like Diego Maradona in the 1986 World Cup, he did not directly score but pulled the entire German defense towards him and then opened a decisive pass for his teammates. The strategy lies there. Interaction, not just individual results. On to the second story, to lead or not to lead. In the 1983 America's Cup, Dennis Conner's Liberty was in the lead, and everyone was preparing Compa to celebrate. But a bold move by their Australian opponents turned the tables. The paradox of sailing is that the leader often has to imitate the one behind. Why? Because if he goes off course, if his opponent is lucky enough to catch a favorable wind, the entire advantage will evaporate immediately. So lead without daring to go differently. Turns out to be a disadvantage. In business, big guys like IBM or P&GHI are the pioneers. They wait for Apple or Kimberly-Clark to test their new ideas before jumping into mass adoption. The strategy of the leader turned out to be to follow suit to maintain the throne. Paradoxical but logical third story, straight to jail. This is a variation of the famous dilemma. Imagine a Stalin-era conductor. Sitting on the train watching Tchaikovsky's music and being caught by KGB because he thought it was a secret code, he was interrogated separately. Each person facing choosing to remain silent together will receive a light sentence. But if one accuses the other and remains silent, the accuser is almost acquitted, while the other receives a heavy sentence. As a result, both sued and both received worse sentences than if they had cooperated. A painful lesson, even when cooperation brings mutual benefits. Fear and personal selfishness can push everyone into tragedy. That was the harsh strategic logic with which the Cold War nuclear world repeatedly grappled. The fourth story. I stand here. Martin Luther faced the Catholic Church being asked to retract his arguments against papal authority. I cannot and will not withdraw, he said. Here I stand, I can do no other. That indomitability opened the way for the religious Reformation, changing European history. A man who also uses stubbornness as a strategic weapon, refuses to give in to Rousseau and Chaucer single-handedly asserts France's position on the world chessboard. Absolute toughness can turn into power when you don't back down. The opponent has no choice but to accept or lose the entire board, but the price is also heavy. Believe the intolerance. The couple that made a man like Gilles SS succeed with the Suez Island Canal and then fail miserably in Panama because he did not know how to stop before natural limits. The strategy is to choose resilience rather than make it a blind habit. Story number 5, Bell for Cat. The mice came up with a plan to hang a bell to warn of the cat's arrival. Great idea. But who will be the one to risk hanging the bell? It is the tragedy of the masses. Everyone wants to benefit but no one wants to sacrifice first. Mob rule is also based on this paradox. If all rise up, tyranny collapses, but because no one dares to step forward. Fear persists from passengers staying silent in the face of hijackers to workers agreeing to hand over envelopes to taxi dispatchers to avoid getting a bad car. The strategy of the ruler is often cheaper than giving out rewards. Just maintain fear and insecurity. Story 6, The Sharp End of the Wedge. Imagine how industries lobby for protectionist policies when a small industry cries for help. 10,000 jobs are about to be lost, and if each person spends just $4 more, they can be saved. Who wouldn't agree to spend a small amount of money to keep jobs for 10,000 families? But then the textile industry cried for help, the steel industry cried for help, the sugar industry also cried for help in small pieces, adding up to a huge burden. Each family has to pay thousands of dollars just to maintain privileges that no one wants anymore if they look at the big picture. The strategy of interest groups lies in dividing the problem. To blind the public to the true cost, people vote, legislators make concessions. And so society blinds itself in a wedge that is gradually closed. Only by looking further and having a comprehensive vision can this trap be broken. But as the history of U.S. tax reform shows, just 1 minute of letting up, a series of exceptions sneak in, cleverly like small knives, and the whole system is turned upside down. Story 7, Look Before You Leap. How many of us have entered into a decision without realizing its consequences? Choose a job in a faraway city, buy a computer with a different operating system, join an airline's loyalty program, or get married. Every binding step weakens our bargaining position. The company knows it is difficult for employees to relocate, so they give less salary increase. Airlines know their regular customers have accumulated miles, so they don't need to offer big discounts. Same with marriage. What seemed like a 50-50 balance suddenly became asymmetrical when the baby came along. Lesson: know how to use your power before you overwhelm yourself. Claim your reward first while others still need you. Before you are forced into dependence like in the drug dealer's game. Give the kid free stuff and then wait until he gets addicted. When choice is lost, strategy sometimes lies not in the current move but in avoiding the inescapable trap later. Story 8, Mix moves, go to the soccer field, stand with the coach. Will you pass or will you shoot? The opponent is also judging, concentrating his strength in one direction. If you keep making the same choice over and over again, it will be easy for your opponents to figure out. Safety lies not in routine but in unpredictability. Even tennis players understand that serving to your opponent's forehand is suicidal, but it can't be done mechanically. Randomness and uncertainty are weapons. As tax authorities. If audit schedules were completely predictable, every tax evader would adjust to avoid them. Only when the threat of inspection is lurking everywhere can honesty be maintained. In business, if Jet and Big keep advertising on schedule, their competitors will get ahead for a week and then lose back. That spiral can only stop when strategy becomes uncertain. Randomness here is not chaos but another form of order. Unpredictability keeps opponents on edge. Story number 9. Don't give a fool a break. Skyon in the play Wisen tells his father's angry words when someone showed him a new deck of cards and said that if he could make the card jump out and spray cedars in his ear, he shouldn't bet because he would definitely get wet. The principle sounds simple. If someone is too eager to make a bet, it means they know something you don't. On the stock market, in the futures market, every trade is zero-sum, one winner, one loser. So why would your competitor sell to you? Because he believes you will lose. And usually he knows why. A wise strategy is to read the signals behind other people's actions. Why does he dare to be so big? He didn't say it, but his commitment was the message. Remember, the world is full of Nathans hiding their cards, and if we are naive, we will be the ones to suffer. Story 10 closes part Y with emphasis. Games are not just zero-sum conflicts but also have room for cooperation, for common good. Sometimes the greatest benefit comes from both holding back instead of rushing in and exhausting each other. It is in these delicate balances that the art of strategic thinking is most clearly revealed, knowing when to attack, when to retreat, when to be tough, when to be flexible, and most importantly, knowing that your opponent is thinking exactly the same thing. The 10 anecdotes are not just for entertainment, each story I present is a key to open the vast world of strategic thinking. If we only look at them as fragments, we will miss the subtle connections between them. But if we put them together, we see a picture. Strategy is a game of interaction, where power comes not from single actions but from anticipating and reacting within a network of constraints. Come back with hot hands. Maybe a player doesn't throw more accurately, but his heat forces the opponent to change the whole layout. From there his team benefited. The so-called illusion turns out to have strategic reality. The value of an individual is not in his or her numbers but in his or her ripple effect. Here we learn to look beyond the raw data to see the big picture. Then came the boat race. The leader who thought he had a sure win was instead forced to copy his opponent. It teaches us that apparent power can come with invisible strings attached, a paradox both IBM in technology and Gambo in consumer goods demonstrate. The giant, seemingly strong, actually lacks freedom. Only the small ones who dare to gamble have a chance to make a way. Strategy is sometimes not about location but about flexibility. The prison dilemma lesson turns to trust. Every reason drives individuals to betray. But the overall outcome is worse. This cruel logic not only imprisoned 2 men but also imprisoned the superpowers in the nuclear race. A little doubt, a little selfishness. Enough to make the whole world tremble under the shadow of bombs. And so strategy is not just a game of tricks but also an art of trust. Martin Lutto and Zigo take us to the other extreme where absolute toughness turns into strength. Who dares to oppose a determined person? But at the same time, blind stubbornness is also a deadly trap like Jess with the Panama Canal. The lesson here is that toughness must be selective. Strategy is not a wall of silence, but a bow that knows when to draw tight and when to release. And the bell hung around the cat's neck. The story sounds like a children's fairy tale but contains harsh political and social truths. The masses are sometimes powerless before a small ruler. Just because no one dares to take the first step. The strategy of the strong lies in fear, in the ability to punish, not in rewards. Taxi dispatchers profit from the distribution of good and bad cars. Dictators maintain power by sowing fear. Big investors control the market by making the crowd lose everything. The real danger lies not in brute force but in the lack of coordination among the majority. The sharp end of the wedge points out another pitfall: short-term decisions, small slices, add up to collective tragedy. No one objects to spending $4, but everyone shakes their heads when it comes to spending thousands of dollars to nurture privilege. This reveals a paradox. We are often alert to the big things but blind to the small, cumulative strategies. Therefore, we must have a comprehensive vision, beyond individual cases. Look before you leap, mix your moves, don't give a fool a fair shot. The last three stories are like three strong knocks on the door of perception. They remind us that a small decision can become a long-term shackle, that unpredictability is the sharpest weapon, that when someone is too eager to offer you a deal, be suspicious because he knows more than you think. I don't tell these stories to make the audience laugh and then forget. Each anecdote is an exercise in perception. Try changing your perspective. Look not just at the obvious but at the hidden layers of interaction. Once we get into the habit, we'll see that strategy is no longer out of reach. It is present in every conversation, every small decision. And that's when we start to enter the real world of strategic thinking. If you stop at just 10 stories, you might see them as 10 separate short stories, but in depth, they are like chess pieces placed on the table. Each piece has a different shape but all serve a larger board. The chessboard of strategy in life, in business, in politics. The first thing all of these examples have in common is that strategy is always a game of interaction. Hot hands do not increase the individual's scoring probability, but force the opponent to put in effort, making it easier for teammates to score. The leader in sailing must copy the follower. Because victory is not measured by distance but by final position. Conductor in Stalin's prison, Martin Luther before the church, go before Roosevelt. All of which shows that one side's actions only make sense when placed next to the other side's reactions. Second, intuition often leads us astray. Looking at a player scoring many points in a row, we can easily believe that he is hot. But the data denies that, but the strategy does not deny but explains. The heat is not in the throw but in how the opponent reacts. Similarly, it's easy to think that leadership means having autonomy. But the truth is, the leader is most constrained, while the follower is free to create. We often believe that perseverance is a virtue, and we are often right. But DSP has shown that blind perseverance turns into tragedy when the context changes. Third, strategy is the art of looking beyond the first step. When U.S. lawmakers give in branch by branch, everyone thinks they're only losing a little. But together, society loses more than they imagine. When consumers stick with an airline, without a loyalty program, they think they are saving, but in fact they are tying their own hands, leaving the airline with no incentive to reduce prices. When those in power sow fear, they do not need to hand out rewards because people naturally fall into silence. I tell you these paradoxes to make you feel a little uneasy. For strategy's sake, just looking straight ahead would be like going through a maze with your eyes closed. We see the wall right in front of us, but we don't know that the way out lies around the other corner. We need to get into the habit of looking past the first move, looking at the opponent's next reaction, looking at the chain of many resonant actions. That's why I start with stories, not recipes. Because strategy is not simple arithmetic. Where 1C1 is equal to 2. Strategy is a mind game. Where one small action can turn into a domino effect, spreading beyond expectations. And only when we train our eyes to perceive hidden connections do we truly enter this world. Think back, in the 10 stories, do you realize one thing? Individual victory is never separate from the collective picture. Hot hands only make sense when teammates benefit. Leading or following only has value when it comes to who finishes first. The prison dilemma only becomes a tragedy when both choose to betray, and the bell hanging around the cat's neck fails because the group does not cooperate. Small benefits for each industry become a burden when the whole society has to pay. All of which points to strategy as the art of reading the constraints. I want you to remember this feeling of a little discomfort, a little insecurity when your intuition is turned upside down. That is the first step to practicing strategic thinking. Because if you don't dare to doubt your first feeling, you will forever be led by the surface instead of seeing what is happening at the deeper level. Once we recognize the common thread running through the 10 anecdotes, the picture becomes clearer. Strategy is about putting yourself in the other person's mind, not just calculating on paper but imagining what they will think, how they will react, and from there preparing your own steps. Look back at the hot hand trap. The logic here is not that the player's hand is actually more accurate, but that the opponent believes he is more dangerous. When they crowd the marker, new strategies open up and teammates are released. You could call it the power of misperception. An opponent's false belief can also become our weapon. Likewise, in yacht racing or in the technology market, a leading position keeps competitors watching every step. Force the leader to do the same. Giants like IBM know they can't afford to take risks, so they choose to wait, but this also exposes a paradox. It is the little risk taker who seizes opportunity. Strategy is not only about holding the position but also about daring to bet when there is little to lose. The prison dilemma story emphasizes another aspect. Strategy is not only about choosing the right one for yourself but also about convincing others to believe in it. If both prisoners trusted each other, they would receive light sentences, but for lack of trust, both are suffering heavily economically. In politics, in international relations, this repeats over and over again. Strategy is therefore never just dry calculation but also the art of sowing trust. Luther and Zigo's stubbornness is a special case where we don't give our opponents any room to bargain. That is the power of no compromise. But it is also a double-edged sword. On the one hand it increases prestige. On the other hand, it can block your own way out. Strategy. Therefore, it is not always flexible. Sometimes absolute defiance is the right choice. But only when we are sure that the other person has no choice but to accept our conditions. In the story of the bell for the cat, the lesson is that collective fear makes no one dare to step forward. Yet if everyone steps in, the result will be very different from a dictator who exploits this weakness, using punishment instead of reward. The strategy of the dominant is not always costly. Sometimes it just takes an example of punishment to shut everyone up and keep quiet. In this case, it is an involuntary complicity, a small slice of policy like the sugar industry seeking protection that seems harmless but when added together becomes a burden. This is how interest groups strategize their demands to be divided so that no one can object. But in the end, the whole society has to pay the price. And it is here that we see that strategy is not just about being wise in the short term, but about looking at the long-term picture, about practicing foresight. Looking before you leap and mixing up your moves are two complementary principles. When making a decision, we should not only look at the immediate benefits but also see the consequences that come later. At the same time, we must not let our opponents guess what we will do randomly. Uncertainty is your ally. Once we become predictable, we lose before we even start. And finally, when someone is eager to show his hand, we must ask questions. What does he know that we don't? The world is full of traps laid out with friendly smiles. The strategy here is to read the signals behind other people's actions and thereby protect yourself from unfair bets. All 10 stories point to one thing: strategy is not about numbers but about the interaction between heads. Only by putting ourselves in other people's shoes can we truly understand how the world works. Once the 10 stories have settled in memory, they are no longer just fragments, they begin to connect, forming a backbone for strategic thinking. It is clear that strategy never exists in a vacuum. It is always the result of interaction, of seeing the world through the eyes of others. The hot hand shows that the opponent's misconception can be turned into an advantage. Mixing moves emphasizes that we must make our opponent uneasy. Unpredictability, and bell hanging for the cat, exposes collective helplessness as everyone waits for someone else to act. 3 seemingly unrelated stories that emphasize the same point in multiplayer gaming. What other people believe, fear, and guess is more important than objective reality. At the same time, stories like going straight to jail or here, I stand back and talk about faith and commitment. If we break trust, we both lose. But if we block the way back, forcing others to accept our conditions, we can win big. The two opposing poles of trust and coercion together show a strategy that operates in a gray area, where ethics and calculation intertwine, where one must keep one's word while knowing when to push others into a corner. A little slice and look before you leap warns us of the dangers of short-sightedness. Seemingly innocuous decisions today can add up to a huge, strategic burden tomorrow. Therefore, it is not only about solving the immediate problem but also about looking far ahead and calculating the cumulative consequences in politics. This is reflected in the way interest groups exploit every bit of everyday life. It shows up in small, seemingly meaningless decisions that add up. Then comes the story of don't give a fool a fair chance. It forces us to doubt. If a bet looks too good, we might be the prey. Strategy is not just about calculated moves, but also about vigilant intuition, the art of recognizing the signs of trouble before it's too late. Human beings do not behave in isolation but in a web of speculations, expectations, beliefs and even deception when viewed in their entirety. We see strategy as the ability to think across layers. I think you'll think what I'm going to do and so on. If we stop at the first layer, we are easily outdone by others, but if we dig one layer deeper, we will have the advantage. Of course, digging deeper isn't always helpful. Thinking too many levels can lead to paralysis, the key is knowing when to stop. 10 anecdotes do not give us a fixed formula but sow a habit in our heads. Whenever faced with a situation, ask yourself what are others seeing? What move are they waiting for us to make? What is their hidden meaning behind that action? This question more than any mathematical equation is the foundation of strategic thinking. Do you dare to see the world through someone else's eyes? With those 10 anecdotes, I don't intend to give a ready-made rule table because the strategy is not like the multiplication table, where you just need to memorize it to solve it. Strategy is like a blank map, the main roads are there. But the alleys, turns and even traps were gradually filled in by people. I choose to start with a story, because stories always go straight to the mind and stay in the memory. A dry theory that easily disappears. But the image of a group of people afraid to hang bells for cats or the scene of gamblers who believe in hot hands will come to kill us. And when a real-life situation occurs, those images will suddenly return. Knock on the mind like a wake-up call. What do they all have in common? It is the human surprise. We may think we are calculating carefully. But the truth is that other people's behavior always messes up plans. Sometimes the opponent believes the illusion and we gain. Sometimes we fall into illusions and pay the price. Sometimes strength comes from publicly backing down. Sometimes victory comes from keeping your intentions secret. These contradictions are not to discourage us, but to make us understand that in the strategic world, flexibility is the most important weapon. A simple conclusion emerges: strategy is not about playing smarter but about thinking differently. Don't follow mass intuition because it often leads to mass traps. Learn to look back, how to stop when others rush in, how to pretend to be weak when you are actually strong, or how to appear strong to force others to back down. Of course, I only opened the door slightly. These 10 stories are like a warm-up session, to warm up the mind, to overturn the thought patterns that you thought were obvious. And later, in the next sections, we will go into the basic principles, analytical tools, and more complex examples in business, politics, and everyday life. If you just read these stories and chuckle, you'll miss the point. Because it is in these seemingly small stories that the secrets of power and survival are hidden. The next section will show you how to turn intuition into a method. Turn anecdotes into theoretical frameworks so you can enter any game without being an outsider. When you enter a game of chess in life, are you the one plotting or just the piece being moved? Part 2. Every story of strategy begins with a very human conflict. Individual benefit versus common good. I chose to start the section with the prisoner's dilemma. Not because it is novel, but because it exposes the paradox. In that situation, it would be less sinful for both people to remain silent. However, fear and personal calculations made each person choose to confess, and in the end, both received heavy sentences. No one is stupid, but the results are stupid in real life. The scenario appears in many layers. Workers on the assembly line compete to speed up in the hope of getting a bonus, ultimately making the bonus meaningless. Athletes fear being left behind and turn to performance-enhancing drugs, turning the sport into a farce. Countries worried about arming others increased their own arsenals, and the world was caught in a dangerous race. All are fair in the eyes of each and all lose. So how to solve? I don't put my faith in moral advice or preaching movements. Experience shows that people do not change because of the call to break the dilemma. We must create mechanisms, structures strong enough to make cooperation the optimal path. The most obvious way is binding collective bargaining. Arms control agreements, economic alliances, or even a professional club with rules and sanctions. Common ground if broken, violators must suffer the consequences. No fangs. Laws are just on paper, but punishment is not enough. The real driving force of cooperation comes from the future. When the game doesn't end after one round in a repeat game, today you may taste the benefits of betrayal, but tomorrow you will pay the price. So suddenly cooperation makes sense. I remember the famous tit-for-tat experiment. Photoda. It begins with cooperation in retaliation when betrayed but is willing to forgive. That simple strategy proved the most lasting because it was both firm and free of resentment. It teaches that cooperation is not a vague ideal but can arise from the logic of punishment and forgiveness. But cold reason also pointed out a flaw. If the game is certain to end, then people have an incentive to betray in the final round. From there, we can deduce that the penultimate game will also be broken and then gradually move back to the first game. Theory calls this backward induction and it stifles hope. But real life is different. We rarely know where the endgame is, and humans are not computers. They care about reputation, about prestige, about other games that lie ahead. It is this blurriness that opens the door to cooperation. A little uncertainty becomes our ally. To escape the Princess Dilemma trap, we need enforcement mechanisms, long-term commitments and, above all, the shadow of the future. That is the groundwork from which I can lead you into the next chapters where the real strategy begins. Binding moves, trustworthy commitments, and the art of being unpredictable. When it becomes clear that a group can be trapped in the irrational rationality trap. The next question is, can we take the initiative to turn the game around instead of being dictated by it? This is where the seemingly simple but paradoxical concept of strategic moves comes in. Victory sometimes comes not from keeping all options open but from deliberately cutting off some avenues of retreat. A negotiation. If I said I was willing to compromise, you wouldn't believe me. But what if I sign an irreversible commitment, or I create a situation where even if I wanted to, I couldn't go back? At that moment, the promise suddenly took on strategic weight in many cases. It is the art of self-deception. To make others believe. Strategic moves are divided into two types, unconditional and conditional. Unconditional is when I say I will do this. Regardless of how you react. A typical example is building a military base or pouring huge capital and infrastructure, an action that cannot be withdrawn. Signaling determination, there are more subtle conditions, which are threats and promises. I can say, if you do that, I will respond in that way. Or vice versa, if you cooperate, I will reward. Both are intended to influence the opponent's calculations, turning my desired action into their optimal choice. Here, the game is simultaneous, everyone moves without knowing the other's move. Suddenly transformed into a sequential game, where one side initiates and forces the other side to calculate accordingly, is the power of commitment. It changes the structure of the board. The story of nuclear deterrence illustrates this best. The nuclear-armed nation declares, "If you attack, I will respond with devastating force." For that threat to have any weight, they must demonstrate that once the button is pressed, there is no turning back. That is why people design automatic mechanisms, chain reactions, and even place power in the hands of multiple commanders. The bondage here creates terrible trust. Sometimes a strategic move is one that leaves you with no way out in history. There were generals who ordered the burning of boats when landing on enemy land. To let soldiers know that there is no way out, desperation turns into strategic fighting strength. So it's not always about opening up more options. It can be the art of cutting down choices so that others are forced to believe in our determination. But strategic moves are not a haphazard juggling act. It requires precise calculation. Which paths do we cut, which paths do we keep, and what message does it send? A vague commitment is worthless, and an excessive commitment can destroy us. So the move from dilemma to strategic move is the move from being stuck in the game structure to redesigning the game instead of complaining about the situation. We turn it around by controlling our own freedom and thereby affecting the freedom of others. To be free from paradox requires not only rules of the game or repetition but also the ability to manipulate the decision structure itself. That's the start of a whole section about credibility, reliability, and the art of being unpredictable. In the following chapters, a threat is not enough to scare anyone if it lacks certainty. A promise won't make anyone act differently if the listener suspects you'll go back on your word the moment things get better. The trick here is that for a strategy to work, it is not enough to just come up with a move, but to make others believe that the move will actually be made. Imagine a trade bargain. I threatened that if he didn't lower the price, would terminate the contract. If everyone knew that terminating the contract would cause me heavy losses, the threat suddenly became worthless. The opponent smiled and called the student blue. Commitment is only scary when it binds me to an outcome that I can't turn away from. This is where handcuffing becomes an art. There are countless ways to increase credibility, creating exit costs too high if I bet my credibility, reputation, or political capital. Breaking the promise would cost me everything. This is what makes my opponents believe that I would not be foolish enough to turn around and make my commitment public. A private promise can be easily denied, but a public declaration becomes a burden. The leader, by declaring that we would never accept such a condition in front of millions of viewers, put himself in a difficult position to turn back, creating an automatic mechanism. Some commitments are designed so that when a condition occurs, the system operates automatically, as in nuclear deterrence. The chain of alarms and responses makes it difficult for leaders to stop the chain of events, thereby convincing the enemy that the threat will become a reality. In the book I call these commitment devices. They are the way to turn an empty threat into a real sword hanging over the opponent's head. Take the Airbus example. Boeing. When the European Union offered a huge support package to Airbus, they not only pump money but also send a message. We have invested and are ready to defend to the utmost political cost. Economic to withdraw the US's excessive commitment in that situation. Understand that threats are more than just threats. It has become an institutionally locked oath in everyday life. A credible commitment can be much smaller but is still decisive. A businessman signs a contract with huge penalties if he fails to deliver on time. A pair of lovers share a deep secret to keep each other in suspense, or even a man writes a suicide note to send before entering a duel. That letter was the rope that tied him to a dead end. The paradox here is fascinating. We think that power comes from keeping ourselves free, but in strategy, power comes from voluntarily giving up some of our freedom, only when we cannot turn away. New opponents are forced to believe. Of course, commitment has a dark side too. Once you lock your hands, you can also be pulled into the deep hole if the situation changes. The art here, then, is not in haphazard commitment but in choosing the right place and time to put the shackles on yourself. That is the essence of credible commitments. Create a situation where you don't just make a promise, you force yourself to live or die by it. Trust does not always mean transparency. There are situations to win. You are forced to do the opposite and sow uncertainty in your opponent's mind. Let's start with a familiar image from American football. William, one of the greatest hitters in history. When facing a throw, always keep your opponent guessing. He never swung the club in the same rhythm, never revealed any pattern. Every time the pitchers thought they had the wave, Williams changed the rhythm. It is that uncertainty that makes him a legend, a strategist in any field. It also requires similar unpredictability. If you reveal your habits, your opponents will find a way to counter. A general who always marches along the same route will soon be ambushed. A business that always reduces prices over time will be exploited by the market. A tax department that always chooses to conduct audits on a fixed schedule will soon have accountants planning to deal with it. Unpredictability does not mean spontaneous action, it is a form of disciplined randomness. Sometimes the best thing you can do is create a probability rather than a predetermined path. In game theory, this is a strategic mix. You don't choose a single action, but distribute your abilities between multiple actions. This leaves the opponent never sure of his next move. Examples are everywhere. The U.S. tax authorities cannot check every return, but by keeping their selection criteria secret, they sometimes tap into even seemingly small files. They sow insecurity among the people. Anyone can be called. It's that feeling that makes compliance the rational choice. Big fashion brands not only follow trends but also proactively create unpredictable turns, launching innovative collections that competitors cannot adapt to. Uncertainty became a military competitive advantage in World War. General Romeo constantly changed the time, route and troop deployment. Unpredictability keeps opponents on edge. Waste energy preparing for a series of scenarios that often never happen. Humans tend to seek order, to want things to be predictable. But it is when we reject order, placing ourselves in the orbit of uncertainty, that we create control. The less predictable the opponent, the more they lose the ability to calculate accurately, the more likely they are to make mistakes. However, like commitment, unpredictability is not a silver bullet. If you become too erratic, allies will become suspicious, partners will falter, and customers will leave. The art lies in knowing when to be clear and when to be ambiguous. This delicate balance is where the strategist really differentiates, stable enough to build trust, uncertain enough to keep the edge. I've always emphasized that strategy is not just about thinking a few steps ahead, but also about knowing how to make it impossible for your opponent to think ahead of you. And sometimes the most powerful way to achieve that is to instill controlled uncertainty in them. In June 1944, the world witnessed the Normandy landings. But behind that victory is not only force but also the art of sowing uncertainty. The Allies knew that if the Germans guessed the exact landing point, the entire operation could collapse from the start. That was the question that haunted Hitler's command for months. Calais is closer to the UK than the shortest, most convenient route. Geographically, all signs point there. The Allies knew this and they took advantage of it. For weeks before the landing day, they set up a huge diversionary campaign, a ghost army under General Pon with inflatable tanks, wooden planes, fake barracks, and even fake radio signals. Every detail was carefully orchestrated to convince German intelligence that the strike would be aimed at Calais. On June 6, when Allied troops landed in Normandy, the Germans still believed that this was just a diversion, and that the main attack had yet to appear. They kept the main force at CES waiting for the real storm, but it never came. The shadow of an imaginary attack held them back, and the price was complete loss of control of the battlefield. This is the art of Mr. Strategy applied in real life. The Allies did not just launch one plan but deliberately spread out many scenarios. Each scenario is convincing enough to divide the opponent's forces and minds. Uncertainty becomes a weapon. The campaign taught us that in many games it is not necessary to act in the most rational way on paper. What you need to do is convince your opponent that the most reasonable action is what they see. While the truth lies elsewhere, misguided belief is the victory. And when the smoke clears, the lesson still resonates. In the game of strategy, the truth is sometimes less important than what others believe to be the truth. Controlling that belief means controlling the game. Strategy is not just about choosing the best move, but about creating conditions that force you and your opponent to consider that move. No commitment. Most of the claims are just wind. But once words are accompanied by actions that put down stakes, cut off retreat routes, or expose oneself to the public, the situation changes. Remember instant. Martin Luther was more than just a theologian, but also a strategic player by publicly declaring his stance. He makes retreat impossible, or burning bris from ancient armies to modern businesses are examples of self-destructing the path of retreat to force all to move forward. Reputation, a company that has kept its promises and delivered on its commitments will create a history of behavior that will convince any future competitor that it will do the same this time. Reputation is a form of strategic asset, invisible but extremely effective. On the contrary, losing reputation, even just once, can destroy all future deterrence or negotiation capabilities. One subtle point: not every commitment should be kept. A wise strategist knows what to tie himself to and what to keep flexible. Too many commitments will make you rigid and vulnerable. Too little and no one will take your word seriously. That line is an art in the business world. This is evident in bargaining. A company may dare to lower the price of a new product to an unbelievable low, taking a short-term loss, just to signal to the market that it is committed to staying in the long term. Competitors understand the message that if they want to defeat it, they must endure a long-term war. Many times, just seeing that level of commitment, the opponent retreats, avoiding a bloody war. From the fox and the thin wedge to player prisons to generals burning bridges to decoy landings. It all comes down to one idea. Strategy is to turn words into facts that must be taken into account. And that truth often lies not in absolute power but in the ability to control one's own choices and those of others. Any game theory only comes alive when it incorporates constraints. Strategy games do not take place in an ideal world where everyone is free to change their moves at the last minute. It takes place in real life, where bridges have burned, promises have been made, and eyes are on commitment. It is a two-sided tool after all. It can turn the weak into the strong, but it can also turn the wise into fools. The deciding factor lies in the context and design of the commitment. In many examples, the binding has a surprising effect. A negotiator not only said "I wouldn't back down," but signed the contract, even made it public in the press. From that moment on, the partners are forced to reconsider, or as in politics. When a leader puts his reputation on an election promise, Chi understands that he has more incentive to carry it out than to break it, but danger is always lurking. A commitment that is too rigid can lead to tragedy. History records many times that wars broke out simply because the parties locked themselves into irrevocable threats. A general swore that if the enemy fired a bullet, we would respond fully to that statement. When it is publicly declared, there is no room for flexibility. And when the first bullet flies, the machinery of destruction is immediately set into motion. So the art of commitment lies not in saving yourself from doubt but in knowing when to lock in and when to keep a gap. It's the fine line between assertiveness and flexibility. An additional concept clarifies this. Vague commitments. Commitments. Instead of a hard oath, sometimes players opt for language that is vague enough to be a deterrent but still leaves a way out. We will respond strongly to any provocation. This saying allows for both determination and flexibility. Others will be wary. But the speaker still has room to adjust his behavior according to the situation. I spend time discussing the art of audience staging. Commitment is only strong when witnessed. A leader who swears an oath in private can easily take it back. But when millions of people have heard, withdrawal means loss of prestige, even loss of power. Thus, many commitments are made not to directly convince the other party but to lock one's hands in the public eye. Strategy is not a quiet calculation in an individual's head but a series of social actions in which beliefs, witnessing and shared history play a crucial role. Strategy games are human games, full of emotions, full of fears, full of the desire to control the future. Power lies not only in how many choices we have, but in our ability to voluntarily give up some of them to make what remains credible and terrifying to others. Paradox, selective loss of freedom is the source of power. Third, the world of strategy is no longer a dry theoretical framework but a living stage where people dare to push the situation to the brink just to force the opponent to retreat. The tension is not about who speaks louder, but about who makes the risk so real that it cannot be ignored. The power of a threat comes not from absolute certainty but from the slim probability of disaster. A warning is only truly respected when it carries the risk that the one giving the warning might lose control of this paradox. Though scary, it is at the core of the game on the brink. Imagine two trains rushing towards each other on the same track. If one side believes that the opponent will change direction, they can continue to accelerate. But if each side shows indomitability, the situation will move closer to collision. The bottom line is who can make the other side believe that they really cannot or do not want to turn back. Sometimes uncertainty is intentionally created: a push button, an easy pin, a hot-headed leader. All aimed at instilling in the other person the fear that the worst outcome could happen. And it is that fear that makes the concession reasonable. Parallel to this dangerous game is its opposite, the need for cooperation. Not every situation is decided by threats. There are situations where people can only survive and develop when they know how to cooperate. The trick lies in getting two or more people to act without formal promises or contracts. A subtle signal, an unspoken rule, or a repetition of encounters can gradually build trust. Coordination sometimes does not require explicit consensus but only enough harmony for each individual to predict the other's actions in politics, in business, or in everyday life. Such coordinated situations are everywhere, from two airlines choosing their departure times to two countries synchronizing their tariff policies to two strangers giving way at a narrow intersection, the logic being that each party has an incentive to adjust their behavior as long as they believe the other will do the same. Sometimes it is a wordless dance, where every step both leads and is led. But the game is not just about coordination or intimidation when the majority participates. Collective choice becomes the central issue of voting. What seems to be a fair and transparent way actually carries profound paradoxes. A set of individual choices does not necessarily make a rational collective decision. Vicious cycles can arise where a majority favors option A over B, B over C, but prefers C over A. Such cycles make the outcome a product of procedure rather than the essence of the general will. The arrangement of the agenda, the way the votes are cast, or the order in which choices are made can all influence the final outcome. Here, the power lies not in a single vote but in the ability to shape the game before it begins. Those who control the rules of the game and can lead a group while maintaining the appearance of democracy understand this. We see the fragility of the so-called majority will. On the negotiating table, the same principles emerged once again. Negotiation is not just about dividing the existing pie, but also the art of creating a bigger pie and dividing it in a way that makes sense to each party. Sometimes concessions now open up greater benefits later. When both sides are clear-headed enough to see the common value, they will find a way to share in a way that neither feels disadvantaged. But when trust is broken, every calculation becomes a one-time game. And the result is often that both parties lose in those negotiations. Time is a double-edged sword. Whoever is more patient usually has the advantage. But waiting too long can also cause opportunities to disappear. The art here is knowing when to give in, when to stand firm, and when to retreat. This delicate balance is what makes negotiation both beautiful and harsh. Underlying every strategy is a fundamental problem. How people respond to motivation, how frames are designed, how goals are set, or how benefits are structured. Anything that can change behavior, whether a wage policy, a tax system, or a promotion program, is based on the same logic. People will do what they find most beneficial within the given context. If the scene is distorted, the result will also be distorted. If the scene is subtle, collective power will be released. All of these ideas, when placed together, form a broad picture of the art of strategic thinking. It is not a bunch of tricks but a new language for understanding human behavior. From the brink of destruction to silent collaboration. From democratic votes to tense negotiations, from individual motivation to collective strength, all are connected by a red thread. Men are truly free only when they know how to calculate in bondage, and truly wise only when they realize that bondage can become a source of strength. If the brink of threat is what creates pressure, then the ability to coordinate is the foundation that helps people escape chaos. Two people walked in opposite directions in a narrow alley, both wanting to pass. But without synchronized steps, the result is only collision. Coordination does not necessarily require words but requires a common anchor, a signal that everyone can read in the world of strategic decisions. That anchor point can be a custom, a rule, or simply a commonly understood unspoken message. But coordination doesn't always come naturally. Sometimes the difficulty lies not in choosing a direction but in making sure that both sides will choose the same. It only takes one person to doubt the whole system, like an intersection without traffic lights. One person stops, the other goes and everything is fine. But if both think the other will give in, chaos ensues. The strategy here is not to win or lose but to survive together in minimal harmony. From there we move on to a more tightly regulated form of surface voting. Voting seems to be a fair solution, many people, many interests, combined into one decision. But when we look closely, we discover a paradox. The results of the ballot do not reflect any stable order. Vicious cycles arise when collective preferences cannot be arranged into a consistent order. The majority prefers A to B, B to C, but prefers C to A. The game of votes thus opens up another kind of uncertainty, political uncertainty. In that situation, power lies not in absolute majority but in the ability to design the rules of the game. Who sets the rules for counting votes, who determines the order of selection? That person shapes the outcome. Voting strategy is not just about ticking boxes, but also a hidden game where those who know the rules can tip the scales. Sometimes just reversing the positions of two choices on the ballot can change the whole result. But people not only participate in voting as a collective ritual, they also negotiate. Negotiation is the moment when both parties know that if they stand alone, they both have something to lose. But if you know how to give in, both can get more. The game of negotiation is a theater of soft power. Who has more endurance, who has more accurate information? Who is willing to leave the negotiating table before all of them become weapons in negotiation? Not only words are decisive but also silence. A well-timed silence can be more powerful than an overt threat. And like brinkmanship, negotiation contains an element of risk. If you push your opponent too far, the rope will break and both will be in a worse situation. The trick is to know where to stop, on the thin line where the common good still remains. Behind every negotiation lies a rarely mentioned but always present driving force. People act not only because of pure reason but also because of the incentive systems that surround them. An employee may put in more effort if the reward is directly tied to results, but may also find ways around the rules if the reward-punishment mechanism opens up loopholes. Motivation is the fire that fuels strategy, but it can also be the fuel for fraud. When incentives are poorly designed, people begin to optimize for themselves rather than for the collective. Hospitals count successful surgeries to reward. Doctors will avoid difficult cases, schools only praise scores. Students study for tests, not for motivation. If not designed cleverly, the system turns into a distorted game where people play for the rules, not for the goals. Rensit coordinates, votes negotiate, dynamics converge in real-life stories. There we see strategy no longer as a theory on paper but as a living battle where principles become weapons and people become real players. From political conferences to business chessboards, from international boardrooms to everyday life, all resonate with the same beat. The constant calculations for survival and victory. If we stop at negotiation or coordination, the strategic picture is still missing an important piece. Information. The world is not always transparent about information asymmetries. When one side knows more than the other, strange distortions in behavior are created. The used car seller knows exactly what kind of problems the car has had, but the buyer doesn't. What are the consequences? Buyers are always skeptical and the price they are willing to pay is lower. In turn, good car sellers withdrew from the market. Only the low-quality car dealers remain. This is the art market, a clear illustration of the breakdown due to asymmetric information. When information is distorted, strategy is no longer a calculation between options but a calculation between layers of beliefs. Buyers not only think about the quality of the car, but also think about the seller's motive for telling the truth. As for the seller, he calculates how suspicious the buyer will be. The mind game unfolds in layers and each layer affects the final outcome. Since then, a series of mechanisms have been invented to fill the gap of trust, warranties, certifications, and third-party reviews. These mechanisms do not eliminate asymmetries but create temporary bridges for people to dare to exchange. However, these mechanisms themselves can also become strategic tools. A long-term warranty can instill confidence in the customer, but it can also be just a way to buy the seller's time. Hopefully the buyer will never complain. Not only sellers, workers are also caught in the information vortex. When applying for a job, candidates know their abilities clearly, but employers do not. To prove, candidates need degrees, experience, achievements. But these signals are sometimes just a show, not necessarily a true reflection of strength. From here another vicious circle is formed: learning not to know but to prove. Work not to create value but to score strategic points again. It lies in the design of the dynamics so that the signal does not become a meaningless game. A degree is valuable when it is actually linked to skills. A certification is meaningful when it comes with responsibility. Otherwise information becomes a weapon of diversion. Instead of transparent bridging, in this same asymmetric environment, we witness another phenomenon: adverse selection. When an insurance company offers low-cost packages, healthy people are less interested, and sick people flock in. As a result, the company suffered heavy losses to balance, so they raised fees. And as premiums rise, the healthy withdraw, and the cycle continues until the insurance market destabilizes. Here the game is no longer between individual and individual but between a whole system and its existence. Along with adverse selection comes the issue of ethics. Once a person has insurance, they tend to be more careless because the cost of risk is transferred to the company. A worker with unemployment insurance may have less incentive to keep his job. A government-backed bank can be more reckless in lending. Here, insurance, which was created to protect, becomes a catalyst for risk. The solution of course lies not in removing insurance or signals but in designing constraints so that they cannot be abused. Insurance contracts may carry deductibles. This means that the buyer still has to bear part of the cost. Job applicants can be tested directly on their abilities instead of just relying on their resumes. The rules of the game must be designed so that cheating is no longer worthwhile, and honesty becomes the least costly path. But even when the information is balanced, the game is not over because behind the mechanisms there are still players with disproportionate power. When one side holds greater leverage, be it capital, be it market share, be it political position, the whole chessboard tilts. The strategy then is not just to choose the optimal but to choose what is acceptable in the context of inequality. And sometimes the weaker person has only one choice left, to turn his weakness into an advantage, forcing the stronger person to recalculate such a strategic game. Never flat, the deeper we go, the more we see that each step plants countless layers of subtext, threat, coordination, election, negotiation, motivation, information, asymmetry, morality, and behind it all always echoes questions that are not easy to answer. How to design fair rules when the designer is also a player? There are times when information asymmetry not only creates suspicion but also opens up elaborate games of deception. A company may know that its products are not durable but choose to offer a generous return policy to gain customer confidence in the eyes of the buyer. A return guarantee is proof that the goods are trustworthy. In the seller's calculation, most customers will not have enough patience or time to exercise their rights, so the actual cost is much lower than the benefit from sales. Such a signal could be real, could be a cover. There are also cases where people intentionally send false signals to cover up. A company in financial trouble may still launch massive advertising campaigns, rent fancy offices, or maintain high salaries. All to create a sense of security for investors and customers. Buy time before the truth comes out. Here the strategy is no longer about the product or service but about controlling the flow of trust. But trust is not something that can be manipulated forever. Economic history is replete with examples of signaling bubbles where multiple companies exaggerate and conceal at the same time. Until the system collapsed because of a small weakness at that time. It is recognized that not all signals are valuable. And the only thing left is proven transparency. If information can be a weapon, then strategy is sometimes how to conceal or reveal information at the right time. A good poker player never shows his emotions. A government in trade negotiations may deliberately withhold real growth data to maintain an advantage. Meanwhile, a startup can, on the contrary, expose the whole number, the whole evidence. To create a sense of absolute trust, the choice to reveal or conceal, each side is based on a calculation. Does this information make my position stronger or weaker? Behind every game is a paradox. The truth is not always considered the wisest strategy. Sometimes the truth needs to be obscured to create opportunity. A country may not declare its oil reserves to avoid price manipulation by rivals. A corporation may not disclose new product plans to protect its innovation from competitors. And so, information becomes a double-edged sword. On the one hand, transparency brings stability, on the other hand, ambiguity brings strategic strength. However, this ambiguity is never completely safe. Because when one party realizes they have been misled, trust is lost not only in a relationship but also in the marketplace. One fraud can destroy a reputation built over decades. So the smartest strategy is sometimes to embrace transparency. Not because it's immediately beneficial, but because it fosters a long-term foundation for every game to continue to exist. When observing the market, we also see something interesting. Sometimes participants send signals not only to each other but also to outside audiences. A company that dares to cut prices deeply not only targets direct competitors but also sends a message to customers and even regulators. We are strong enough to survive this war. The signals here are not simply personal messages but weapons in a multi-layered battle. If we pull back the perspective, we see that every information asymmetry leads to the same challenge. How to turn the signal into reality instead of a performance at the individual level. This is a moral issue. At the organizational level, it is a matter of designing the rules of the game. At the social level, it is a struggle to build institutions. Because once the signal and the truth go two different ways, the entire foundation of the market, of politics, of community life will be shaken. It is at this point that we see that strategy is no longer the private matter of clever players but a fundamental question for the functioning of society. If the signal is just an act, the rules must be so strict that no one dares to act anymore. If insurance is abused, the contract must be rewritten so that everyone bears some responsibility. If elections are manipulated by information ambiguity, the institutions must be transparent enough so that voters are no longer led by ghosts. And so, information asymmetry is not just a dry economic concept but a prism that illuminates the way we live, the way we believe, the way we build a strategic society at the deepest level, which is the art of walking between two shores, between truth and illusion, between transparency and ambiguity, between belief and doubt, and this art. No matter how complicated, it all comes down to the eternal question. Do people dare to live honestly with each other? When it comes to the mechanisms set up to deal with information asymmetry, the first thing that must be mentioned is the supervisory institutions, from stock market regulators, professional associations to independent auditing organizations. All of them exist to bridge the gap between signal and reality. But the paradox lies there. These institutions themselves are part of the game. It also has to send a signal about its own transparency and integrity. If the auditor is dishonest, if the regulator is bribed, the verification signal is lost and the asymmetry is doubled. The clearest example is the financial crisis. In the period before 2008, many credit institutions deliberately concealed risks in complex product packages. They send out safety signals through credit rating agencies, which are seen as neutral voices. But when the crisis broke out, people realized that the signal had been distorted at the root and the whole world had to pay the price. It is not just a market breakdown but also a breakdown of confidence in the regulatory mechanisms that are supposed to be the safeguards. Therefore, an important part of strategy in a context of information asymmetry is learning to be skeptical of gatekeepers. Blind faith in the system can be a fatal flaw. Good strategy is not only listening to the signals but also understanding the motives behind them. Who sent this signal? Why do they benefit when I believe in it, and what are the real costs they are hiding? Along with the monitoring mechanisms, there are also tools called self-enforcing contracts. A company that wants to demonstrate transparency might proactively publish quarterly financial reports. Invite international audits instead of just complying with minimum regulations. A politician who wants to assert integrity can voluntarily declare his assets and income. These actions are both signals and commands. If the deception is later discovered, the price to pay will be much greater. But it is also important to note that not everyone has the ability to restrain themselves. Small, vulnerable organizations often lack the resources to demonstrate their transparency, and paradoxically, the dishonest actors often have ample tools to create false transparency. Thus, in the signaling game, the underdog often has to rely on creativity and community. For example, many small businesses have chosen to let customers review them publicly on digital platforms, using collective reputation as a shield. When we put all of this into a larger context, we see that information asymmetry is not simply a problem to be solved, but also a fertile ground for strategic innovation. From product design, pricing, promotion to building trust, everything is governed by information gaps between parties. Who understands this gap? Can that person turn it into an advantage? There is an interesting metaphor. Information in the strategic world is like light in space, some places are bright, some are dark, some are only faint reflections. The wise player not only observes the light but also knows how to read the shadow. Because the shadow shows where the gaps are, where the hidden things are. But the biggest question always comes back. Is it possible to build a world where information asymmetry is minimized? Answer: as many scholars have pointed out, it is not absolute. Because human nature is finite, we cannot know everything, cannot predict everything. Even in a family between two people in love there are always dark corners. So in a society, an economy, information asymmetry is inevitable. What can be done is to accept its existence and design the rules of the game so that it is not exploited excessively. It is at this point that strategy games become both brutal and humane. Harsh because those who do not understand the law will be eliminated. Humane because properly designed laws can protect the weak, limit manipulation and maintain trust so the game continues, creating institutions, constraints, and mechanisms that keep signals and truth from straying too far apart. Because if that gap continues, not only will one player lose, but the entire system will collapse. If the mechanisms of supervision and restraint are the external fence, then human psychology is the internal battlefield. Information asymmetry not only creates gaps in understanding but also triggers instinctive emotions, fear, greed, doubt and even blind confidence. Look at the stock market, where signals and sentiment collide every second. When a company announces good news, stock prices rise not only because of the news, but also because the crowd believes that others will believe the news too. The game becomes a loop. I buy not because I believe but because I believe that others will believe. That spread could fuel a price bubble. And when the bubble bursts, people blame each other for being gullible. In politics, this mentality is even more evident. A campaign promise is sometimes not absolutely believed, but is still supported because voters think the majority will lean towards that side. The asymmetry here is not that one side knows the truth and the other does not, but that no one knows what the other really believes. Collective belief becomes a mirror game where the shadow of expectation is stronger than the truth itself. For this reason, many clever strategies exploit not information but the expectation of information. A startup may not have a finished product yet but still be highly valued by creating expectations that tomorrow will be bright. A government may delay reform, but maintain power by sowing hope that something great is in store. In both cases, the game revolves around psychological management rather than data management. So learning to read the crowd becomes a vital strategic skill. The problem is that the mind is unstable, it is like the tide, rising and falling. No one can predict exactly. A little shock, a rumor is sometimes enough to reverse the flow. Good players don't try to predict every wave exactly, but try to position themselves so that no matter how the wave rises or falls, they won't be swept away. Besides crowd psychology, there is a more subtle aspect than individual psychology when faced with asymmetry. When we know we are less informed than our opponents, the fear of being exploited can make us overly defensive. Refuse any deal even if it is profitable. Conversely, when we believe we have more information, our confidence can lead us to take risks, opening up opportunities for our opponents to counterattack. The swing between these two states, doubt and arrogance, is where strategy is forged. If we put it all in a social context, we see that information asymmetry also creates stratification. Those who have access to information, financial people, officials, and experts are often in an advantageous position, while those who only receive indirect signals are easily led. If this gap is not contained, it will widen inequality as belief in fairness is shaken, and society can easily fall into extremes, either doubting everything or blindly clinging to simple signals. Understandably, it is also fertile ground for manipulators. A viral fake news does not need to be true. It just taps into the emotion that is already there. In the digital age, where signals travel faster than facts, asymmetry becomes even more dangerous. Someone who knows how to manipulate signals can create a temporary reality, enough to gain benefits and then disappear, leaving behind the chaos. But it is here that we see more clearly than ever the responsibility of the participants in the game. It is impossible to rely solely on regulations or oversight. Individuals must develop the ability to analyze signals, verify sources, and accept that no information is completely impartial. Strategic maturity begins when we stop looking for absolute certainty and learn to live in a world of uncertainty, where everything can be a false signal, and there is another approach. Turn uncertainty into a part of strategy. Instead of trying to eliminate all asymmetries, players can design their moves so that uncertainty becomes a tool. An example is international negotiations. Sometimes a side deliberately leaves information about its military capabilities unclear for the purpose of deterrence, and ambiguity becomes strength, as long as it is controlled. The key point here is that information asymmetry is not necessarily all bad. It is the stuff of strategy. The bad thing happens when it is overused, when players abuse fake signals to distort the rules. Good happens when asymmetry is intentionally designed. To maintain the delicate balance between competition and cooperation lies precisely in that gray area. Strategy games show its complexity and beauty. Looking back at the whole, we can see that much of the story in this section revolves around a paradox. Information is both a source of power and a source of instability. Those with more information may have the upper hand, but also face increased risks of exposure and counterattack, or be suspected by the crowd. And those who are less informed, seemingly weaker, sometimes have the advantage of freedom. They are not tied down by redundant data, can act leaner, bolder. This paradox explains why many great strategists in history have chosen to remain obscure. They never expose their full potential, nor do they try to know everything. Instead, they seek to position themselves so that no matter which direction the information flows, they maintain an advantage. Like a person walking in a fog, instead of trying to clear the fog, they learn to listen to the sounds, watch their steps, and choose the path of least risk. When looking at today's reality, this becomes even more evident. The data age creates an illusion that knowing more means being safer. But the truth is, the more data, the easier it is to get stuck in the chaotic signal matrix. A government with thousands of reports per day, a corporation with countless analytical indicators, an individual with an endless stream of information from social media. All are at risk of drowning in a sea of data, losing the ability to discern the kernel of truth. So what is needed to survive in that world is not the ability to know everything, but the ability to know when to give up. The art of strategy is sometimes the art of denial, of knowing how to ignore false signals, of knowing how to block the flow of redundant information and keep only what is valuable for your move. Wisdom lies in understanding that not all information is reliable and not all data is necessary. It was at this moment that I realized another truth. Information asymmetry never goes away. It is the nature of the world. Trying to eliminate it completely is an illusion. The real question is not how to eliminate imbalance but how to live with it and use it wisely. Smart players accept living with the darkness but know how to place the lamp in a position that is just bright enough to light the way without revealing everything. The final image we can imagine of this game is a chessboard covered with bones. Every move of a piece creates a signal, which can be real or false. The observer must evaluate, doubt, and act. He who trusts absolutely will be deceived. He who doubts everything will be paralyzed. Only those who dare to walk in the gray area, who dare to accept uncertainty as an inevitable part, have a chance to go deep into the game. And perhaps the most profound lesson here is that information asymmetry tests not only strategic ability but also human character. It poses the question of whether we will use our advantage to manipulate or to balance. Will we let ourselves drift with the crowd or will we train ourselves to see the shadow of expectations? The answer is never simple. But it is there that maturity is formed. The art of playing in the open is not the art of certainty but the art of courage. Courage to accept that we will never know everything. The courage to act when data is lacking and, more importantly, have the courage to take responsibility for your moves, win or lose. Because in the end information asymmetry is just a mirror image. It exposes human fragility, greed, fear and hope. And when we look into that mirror, we see more clearly not only the world out there but also ourselves. In a moment of weakness, pride, desire for control, and helplessness in the darkness, I would like to stop here as if to close a long and winding intellectual journey. If you have listened up to this point, I want to give you a sincere thank you. Because reading or listening to a book is not just consuming knowledge but a form of silent collaboration between the writer and the receiver. Between the thoughts of the past and the liveliness of the present. Now the book is closed, but the ideas about strategy, about how people behave in the tangled relationship of power, interests, and choices still open many other doors. If you found anything about this book suggestive or, conversely, anything that left you confused, I would love to hear your feedback. It is your reviews and comments that make a book live on in the reading community. Instead of just staying on the page, and if you want to go further, want to challenge yourself with another book that might be more intense, more gentle, or simply touch on a question that you're carrying. Give me your suggestions, I will listen and will join you on a new journey of knowledge. And now book says goodbye and see you again.